bride's family disresbces groom's black grandmother. Then they get the shock of their lives. Why did the bride's snobbed family relentlessly disrespect the groom's plainly dressed black grandmother all evening? Get ready for the ultimate shock when her son, a world-famous billionaire philanthropist, walks in unexpectedly to defend her honor and deliver a lesson they'll never forget. Like, subscribe, and listen now to hear how this powerful twist unfolds. The crystal champagne flute trembled slightly in Beatrice Montgomery's perfectly manicured hand, not from nerves, but from suppressed laughter. Across the lavishly decorated dining table, adorned with cascading roses and flickering candlelight at the Montgomery family estate, sat Evelyn Carter, the groom's grandmother. Her simple navy dress stood in stark contrast to the designer gowns and bespoke suits surrounding her. As Mrs. Carter, a woman of quiet dignity with kind eyes and neatly pinned silver hair, reached for her water glass, Beatrice leaned forward, seemingly adjusting her own place setting. A deliberate nudge. The water glass tipped, sending a cascade of ice water splashing onto the pristine white tablecloth and darkening the hem of Mrs. Carter's dress. "Oh, clame," Beatrice exclaimed, her voice dripping with false concern, though a malicious glint sparkled in her eyes. How terribly unfortunate. Her mother, Eleanor Montgomery, seated nearby, let out a barely concealed titter, dabbing at her lips with a linen napkin. The groom, Michael Carter, seated beside his grandmother, stiffened, his knuckles white where he gripped his fork. His fiancée, Sophia Montgomery, Beatrice's younger sister, glanced quickly at Mrs. Carter, then looked away, her cheeks flushing slightly, seemingly unable or unwilling to meet the blatant cruelty head-on. A ripple of uncomfortable silence followed, broken only by the clinking of silverware as other guests studiously avoided looking at the spreading stain or the elderly woman now quietly blotting her dress. Mrs. Carter herself simply inclined her head slightly, murmuring, "It's quite all right, dear. Accidents happen." But the deliberate nature of the accident, the open mockery in Beatrice's eyes, and the chilling indifference of the Montgomery hosts hung heavy in the opulent air, a moment of calculated social cruelty sharp enough to cut glass. Why was this happening? And who would dare treat a guest, an elder, with such blatant disrespect at a pre-wedding celebration? The Montgomery family occupied a rarefied echelon of East Coast society, their wealth inherited through generations, their names synonymous with old money, exclusive clubs, and a carefully guarded sense of social superiority. Their sprawling estate in a wealthy enclave outside Philadelphia was a testament to their status, filled with antiques, manicured gardens, and the pervasive, unspoken belief that their lineage placed them above the common fray. Eleanor Montgomery, the family matriarch, ruled her social sphere with an iron will and thinly veiled disdain for anyone outside their circle. Her husband, Charles, was quieter but equally proud, viewing the world through the lens of pedigree and portfolio. Their eldest daughter, Beatrice, mirrored her mother's snobbery with added spite, while the younger daughter, Sophia, seemed genuinely kinder, though perhaps naive or overly influenced by her family's ingrained prejudices, often choosing harmony over confrontation. Sophia's engagement to Michael Carter had been met with polite, yet palpable, disapproval by her family. Michael, 30, was a successful architect with his own thriving firm in Philadelphia, intelligent, kind, and deeply in love with Sophia. But in the Montgomerys' eyes, he was inescapably new money at best, and worse, came from a background they considered utterly unremarkable, a middle-class black family from Virginia. Michael's parents were retired educators, respected in their community, but possessing none of the vast wealth or social connections the Montgomerys valued. The true heart of Michael's family was his grandmother, Evelyn Carter. A retired high school English teacher and librarian in her late 70s, Mrs. Carter was a woman of immense grace, quiet intellect, and unshakable dignity. Widowed young, she had raised her children while actively participating in the civil rights movement in the 60s, later becoming a beloved educator who inspired generations of students in her Virginia hometown. She carried herself with a serene composure that hinted at deep reserves of strength, forged through navigating a lifetime of societal prejudice with unwavering integrity. Michael adored her, seeing her as the moral compass and emotional anchor of their family. He knew bringing her into the Montgomerys' orbit for the wedding festivities would be a challenge, given their thinly veiled snobbery, but Sophia had assured him, perhaps optimistically, that her family would be perfectly welcoming once they got to know the Carters. Missing from the rehearsal dinner, delayed by supposed international business, was Evelyn's son and Michael's uncle, William Carter. While Michael knew his uncle was a highly successful businessman involving global investments and notable philanthropic work, the full public extent of William's influence and fame was something the Carter family rarely discussed, valuing privacy and humility over public recognition, a stark contrast to the Montgomerys' obsession with status. The Montgomerys, barely acknowledging Michael's side of the family beyond cursory background checks, likely had no inkling of William Carter's true standing or his connection to the unassuming elderly woman they were preparing to dismiss. The rehearsal dinner began with a series of subtle, yet pointed, slights directed at Evelyn Carter, setting the tone for the evening. As the Carter family, Michael, his parents, and Evelyn arrived at the Montgomery estate, Eleanor greeted them with a brutal smile that didn't reach her eyes. While she gushed over Michael's parents with forced politeness, her gaze slid over Evelyn almost dismissively. Inside the opulent ballroom, decorated with an almost ostentatious display of wealth, the seating arrangement spoke volumes. While Michael's parents were placed at a respectable side table, Evelyn found her place card at the furthest end of the main family table, tucked away near a service entrance, flanked by distant Montgomery cousins who barely acknowledged her. It was a calculated move designed to marginalize her, to render her invisible. Michael saw it instantly, his jaw tightening. He exchanged a look with his mother, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, signaling, "Let it go for now." Evelyn herself merely located her seat with quiet grace, unfolding her napkin without comment. The first overt insult came shortly after everyone was seated. Eleanor, raising her voice slightly to carry across the table, remarked to her husband Charles, loud enough for Evelyn and Michael to hear clearly, "Charles, darling, did you see the charming little church where Michael's family attends? So quaint. Very different from St. Augustine's, of course." The implication was clear, different, and implicitly lesser. Charles chuckled indulgently. "Indeed, my dear. Different worlds." Michael felt a flush of anger rise, but held his tongue, not wanting to cause a scene before the dinner even began. He caught Sophia's eye across the table. She offered a small, nervous smile, quickly looking away. Then came Beatrice's whispered comment to her aunt, as Evelyn politely declined a pre-dinner glass of champagne. "Probably prefers sweet tea, I imagine. Doesn't know what she's missing." The aunt tittered. These initial moments, the dismissive greeting, the pointed seating, the condescending remarks, constituted the inciting incident. It wasn't one single action, but the immediate, clear establishment of the Montgomerys' intent to demean and exclude Evelyn Carter based on their prejudiced assumptions about her race and background. Michael's initial goal became painfully clear: survive the evening, shield his grandmother as much as possible, and desperately hope his fiancée, Sophia, would recognize the hostility and intervene. Evelyn's goal, equally clear, was to endure the evening with the quiet dignity that was her hallmark, refusing to let their pettiness diminish her. Michael's reaction was simmering anger and profound disappointment in Sophia's passivity. Evelyn's reaction was one of practiced composure, masking the familiar sting of prejudice with unwavering grace. The battle lines for the evening had been drawn. The dinner progressed, and so did the relentless campaign of subtle and not-so-subtle humiliations directed at Evelyn Carter. Each incident seemed carefully orchestrated, designed to make her feel uncomfortable, unwelcome, and inferior. After the water-spilling accident engineered by Beatrice, the conversation at the Montgomery end of the table seemed to deliberately exclude Evelyn. They discussed European travel, yachting seasons, and obscure art auctions. Topics clearly chosen to highlight their sophisticated world, implicitly contrasting it with what they assumed was Evelyn's limited experience. When Evelyn politely tried to join the conversation, mentioning a recent exhibition of Southern folk art she enjoyed, Eleanor Montgomery simply raised an eyebrow and murmured, "How rustic," before pointedly turning away to speak to someone else. Michael attempted to engage his grandmother in conversation, speaking across the table, but his efforts were often interrupted or drowned out by louder pronouncements from Charles or Eleanor. He felt increasingly furious and helpless, trapped by the social niceties of the occasion and Sophia's continued inaction. Sophia looked increasingly miserable, trapped between her fiancé's palpable anger and her family's appalling behavior. But she seemed paralyzed, unable or unwilling to directly confront her parents or sister. The toast delivered by Charles Montgomery was another calculated blow. Holding his wine glass aloft, he spoke eloquently about his beloved daughter Sophia, about the bright future ahead, before pausing dramatically. "And we welcome," he continued, his gaze flicking briefly towards Evelyn with a condescending smirk, "Michael's family into our circle. An opportunity, perhaps, for cultural exchange." He let the phrase hang, heavy with implication. "We trust they will find our family traditions enlightening." The polite, knowing laughter that followed felt like tiny daggers to Michael. A cousin seated near Beatrice leaned over and stage-whispered, just loud enough, "Might need to explain which fork is for the fish," making Beatrice giggle conspiratorially. Evelyn simply took a slow sip of her water, her expression serene, though Michael saw the slight tightening around her eyes. The final, most pointed insult came with dessert. A delicate, complex pastry was served. As the waiter placed Evelyn's plate down, under the watchful eye of Eleanor, he fumbled, causing the intricate dessert to slide, smearing cream across the plate's edge. "Terribly sorry, madam," the waiter mumbled, clearly embarrassed but also frightened, likely acting under duress. Beatrice seized the moment. "Oh dear," she exclaimed with exaggerated sympathy. "Perhaps too complicated? We should have requested some simple pound cake, shouldn't we, mother?" Eleanor smiled thinly. "Simplicity does have its place, Beatrice dear, though perhaps not at a Montgomery dinner." This time, Evelyn didn't remain entirely silent. Looking calmly at Beatrice, she replied, her voice soft but clear, "A complicated appearance doesn't always guarantee substance, young lady. Sometimes the simplest things hold the most value." Her quiet wisdom momentarily silenced Beatrice, but the cumulative effect of the evening's hostility was undeniable. The complications were clear. The Montgomerys were relentless in their prejudice, enabled by their social standing and the complicity of their guests. Sophia was proving incapable of standing up to her family. Michael felt increasingly alienated and angry, questioning the foundation of his relationship with Sophia. Evelyn, while outwardly composed, was being subjected to relentless disrespect. The rising action was a crescendo of calculated insults, raising the stakes for everyone involved and pushing the situation towards a breaking point. Could Michael endure this? Could Sophia find her voice? How much more could Evelyn tolerate with such grace? The breaking point, for Michael at least, arrived shortly after the dessert incident. The casual cruelty, Sophia's continued failure to intervene meaningfully, and the profound disrespect shown to the woman he admired most in the world became unbearable. Excusing himself abruptly from the table, he signaled for Sophia to follow him out of the ballroom onto a moonlit terrace overlooking the vast Montgomery Gardens. The cool night air did little to temper the heat of his anger. "Sophia," he began, his voice low but shaking with suppressed fury, "I can't do this. I cannot sit here and watch your family treat my grandmother like she's dirt beneath their shoes. Did you see what Beatrice just did? Did you hear your father's toast? Your mother's comments?" Sophia wrung her hands, tears glistening in her eyes. "Michael, I know it's awful. They're being difficult, but that's just how they are sometimes. They don't mean it the way it sounds. They don't understand." "Don't understand?" Michael interrupted, incredulous. "Sophia, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is deliberate cruelty. It's snobbery, it's racism, and it's directed at the kindest, most dignified woman I know. And you just sit there. You smile politely. You change the subject. You let them walk all over her, all over us. What do you want me to do?" Sophia cried defensively. "Start a screaming match at our rehearsal dinner? Humiliate my parents? I want you to stand up for what's right." Michael shot back, lowering his voice again, but the intensity burning in his eyes. "I want you to show me, that you won't tolerate prejudice, not even from your own family. How can we build a life together, raise children together, if you can't defend the people I love? If you tacitly accept this kind of behavior, is this what our life will be like? Me constantly swallowing insults, my family being treated as second-class citizens at your family's events." The questions hung heavy between them. Sophia looked devastated, torn between the man she loved and the family whose approval she had always craved, whose ingrained biases she had perhaps never truly confronted. Michael's ultimatum, unspoken but clear, forced a crisis. Could she challenge her family's deeply rooted prejudice? Could she choose her future with Michael over the path of least resistance within her family? This confrontation was the turning point. It shifted the conflict from being solely between the Montgomerys and Evelyn/Michael to being fundamentally about the viability of Michael and Sophia's relationship itself. Sophia was forced to acknowledge the severity of her family's actions and her own complicity through silence. The initial goal of simply enduring the dinner was gone. Now, the stakes involved the future of their marriage before it even began. Sophia realized she couldn't remain passive. She had to make a choice, a stand. The point of no return had been reached for their relationship, demanding action and change, not just polite endurance. Shaken and ashamed after Michael's impassioned confrontation, Sophia returned to the dinner table with a newfound, albeit trembling, resolve. The easy path of avoidance was no longer an option. She knew Michael was right. Her family's behavior was inexcusable, and her silence had been cowardly. She had to try. She waited for an opportunity, her heart pounding. When Charles Montgomery began recounting an anecdote about a rather common business associate he'd recently encountered, clearly another veiled jab at perceived social inferiors, Sophia took a deep breath. "Father," she interjected, her voice slightly unsteady but clear. "Perhaps we could talk about something more pleasant? Mrs. Carter," she turned deliberately towards Evelyn, forcing the table's attention. "Michael told me you were a wonderful English teacher for many years. What were some of your favorite books to teach?" The effect was immediate, but not what Sophia hoped for. Charles paused, looking surprised and slightly annoyed at the interruption. Eleanor raised a perfectly plucked eyebrow. Beatrice smirked openly. "Oh, Sophia, darling," Eleanor said dismissively, waving a baring hand. "Let's not bore everyone with school stories." Charles was just getting to the amusing part about the man's dreadful tie. She then seamlessly steered the conversation back to her husband, effectively shutting Sophia down. Sophia felt her cheeks burn. She tried again a few minutes later, attempting to compliment Evelyn's simple but elegant dress. Beatrice cut her off mid-sentence with a loud, affected laugh at something someone else said, pointedly ignoring both Sophia and Evelyn. It became painfully clear her family was not just prejudiced. They were actively resistant to any attempt by Sophia to bridge the gap or show Evelyn respect. Her quiet rebellion was easily quashed by their practiced social maneuvering and utter disregard. Michael watched Sophia's futile efforts, his expression a mixture of sympathy for her struggle and grim validation of his earlier anger. He saw her try, saw her fail, saw her deflate under her family's dismissive control. He reached for her hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement of the difficulty, but his eyes held a question. Now what? Evelyn Carter, observing the entire exchange with her usual quiet perspicacity, gave Sophia a brief, gentle smile across the table. It wasn't pitying, it felt like understanding, perhaps even encouragement. It was a silent message. "I see you trying. Keep your dignity." Evelyn then gracefully excused herself for a moment, perhaps needing a brief respite from the oppressive atmosphere. Sophia felt utterly defeated. She had tried to stand up, however weakly, and her family had effortlessly slapped her back down. Regrouping internally, she realized the problem was far deeper than she had ever allowed herself to believe. Confronting them head-on in this setting was impossible. They held all the social power within their domain. Despair began to set in. How could her marriage to Michael possibly work if this impenetrable wall of prejudice stood between their families? The path forward seemed impossibly blocked. The dinner dragged on, each passing moment solidifying the chasm between the Carters and the Montgomerys, leaving Sophia and Michael in a state of tense, unresolved crisis as the evening drew towards its bitter conclusion. As coffee and liqueurs were served, the atmosphere remained thick with unspoken conflict. Sophia sat beside Michael, holding his hand tightly, her earlier attempts at intervention abandoned, replaced by a quiet misery. Michael's anger had cooled into a hard, resigned knot in his stomach. He was already mentally composing the difficult conversation they would need to have later, the one about whether a future together was even possible under these circumstances. Evelyn Carter had returned to her seat, her composure intact, engaging in polite, minimal conversation with the distant cousin seated beside her. The Montgomerys, sensing victory, seemed to relax into their smug superiority. Eleanor regaled the table with plans for the extravagant wedding, pointedly emphasizing details designed to highlight their wealth and status. Charles pontificated about family legacy, subtly reinforcing the idea of the Montgomery lineage as something ancient and important, implicitly contrasting it with the Carters' perceived lack of history. Beatrice added occasional snide remarks, feeding off her parents' arrogance. They were putting on a performance of untouchable social dominance. It felt like the final act of the humiliating charade. There seemed to be no recourse, no way to challenge their entrenched power within the walls of their own estate. Michael squeezed Sophia's hand, ready to suggest they make their excuses and leave this toxic environment as soon as politeness allowed. He glanced at his grandmother, expecting to see weariness or resignation in her eyes. Instead, he saw a flicker of something else: patience, anticipation. Just as Charles was launching into another self-congratulatory anecdote, the double doors at the far end of the grand ballroom swung open silently. A man stood silhouetted against the brighter light of the hallway. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that spoke of quiet expense, his silver hair catching the light. He paused for a moment, his presence commanding immediate attention. A hush fell over the table as heads turned. Several guests gasped softly in recognition. Michael felt his own breath catch. Uncle William? What was he doing here? He was supposed to be in Zurich. William Carter surveyed the room, his sharp eyes quickly taking in the scene. The opulent setting, the seating arrangement, the strained expressions on Michael and Sophia's faces, the quiet dignity of his mother at the far end of the table, the preening arrogance of the Montgomerys. His gaze lingered for a moment on his mother, and a subtle warmth softened his stern features. Then he began to walk purposefully into the room, his footsteps echoing slightly on the polished floor. The air crackled. The power dynamic in the room shifted almost tangibly with his entrance. The Montgomerys looked momentarily confused, then recognition dawned, followed by disbelief and a sudden, visible unease. Charles faltered mid-sentence. Eleanor sat up straighter, her hand fluttering nervously towards her pearls. Beatrice stared, her mouth slightly agape. The final test wasn't a confrontation initiated by Michael or Sophia, but the unexpected arrival of a figure whose mere presence threatened to shatter the Montgomerys' carefully constructed world and expose their behavior on a stage they couldn't control. The build-up wasn't a final insult, but the sudden, terrifying appearance of unforeseen accountability. William Carter walked directly to the far end of the table, bypassing the sputtering attempts by Charles and Eleanor Montgomery to greet him. He stopped beside his mother. Evelyn Carter bent down and kissed her warmly on the cheek. "Mom," he said, his voice rich and clear, easily carrying through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "Forgive my delay. My flight from Zurich landed early. I couldn't possibly miss celebrating Michael and Sophia." He straightened, turning to face the room, specifically the bewildered Montgomerys. His earlier warmth vanished, replaced by a cool, appraising gaze that held unmistakable authority. "For those of you who may not know," William announced, his voice resonant, "I am William Carter. And this remarkable woman," he placed a proud hand on Evelyn's shoulder, "is my mother, Evelyn Carter." He let that sink in, watching the color drain from Eleanor's and Beatrice's faces, seeing Charles's jaw tighten. "My mother," William continued, his voice gaining intensity, "taught me everything I know about integrity, resilience, and the true meaning of wealth. She raised me alone while teaching generations of students, marched for civil rights when it was dangerous to do so, and instilled in me the values that led me to establish the Carter Foundation." He paused, letting the name, synonymous globally with massive philanthropic investment in education, healthcare, and human rights, hang in the air. Every hospital wing we've funded, every scholarship we've granted, every community we've helped rebuild stands on the foundation of character she built within me. He looked directly at Eleanor, then Beatrice, then Charles. "Character," he repeated softly, the word landing like a judgment. "Something my mother also taught me is utterly independent of bank accounts or fancy houses. It's about how you treat people, all people, especially your elders, your guests. His gaze swept pointedly over the table, lingering for a moment on the water stain near Evelyn's seat. It seems some here tonight have forgotten that fundamental lesson. The humiliation was absolute, delivered with surgical precision. Eleanor tried to stammer an apology. Mr. Carter. William. We had no idea. Evelyn. Mrs. Carter, please forgive. Evelyn Carter finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying immense weight, cutting through Eleanor's flustered words. There is nothing to forgive, Mrs. Montgomery, she said, looking directly at Eleanor, not with anger, but with a profound, almost weary pity. Your actions tonight reflected not on me, but on you. You judged my worth by my dress, by the color of my skin, by assumptions rooted in ignorance. True poverty isn't lack of money. It's lack of kindness, lack of empathy, lack of character. In that regard, her gaze swept over Eleanor, Charles, and Beatrice. I find I must pity you. Her words, delivered with quiet dignity, were more devastating than any shout. Beatrice looked ready to faint. Charles stared fixedly at his wine-glass. Sophia burst into tears, finally overwhelmed by shame and relief. Guests began rising, moving towards Evelyn, murmuring apologies for the family's behavior, expressing admiration, effectively leaving the Montgomerys utterly alone and disgraced at their own table. The rest of the rehearsal dinner dissolved in awkwardness for the Montgomerys. They became social pariahs in their own home, their carefully curated world shattered by the quiet dignity of Evelyn Carter and the revealed status of her son. William Carter spent the remainder of the evening ensuring his mother was treated with the utmost respect, sharing anecdotes of her inspiring life with captivated guests, effectively holding court while the Montgomerys faded into the background. In the aftermath, the power dynamic was irrevocably altered. Sophia, deeply ashamed, had a long, difficult conversation with Michael and Evelyn, offering a heartfelt apology for her passivity and vowing to confront her family's prejudice head-on, regardless of the consequences. While the wedding proceeded days later, it was a more subdued, significantly less ostentatious affair, planned with genuine input from the Carter family. The Montgomerys attended, humbled and marginalized, forced to reckon with the public exposure of their bigotry. Whether the incident truly changed Eleanor, Charles, or Beatrice remained uncertain, but their social standing took a significant hit. Whispers followed them, and invitations to certain exclusive circles dwindled. Sophia began the long process of trying to educate her family, creating boundaries, and building a marriage with Michael based on mutual respect that actively challenged her upbringing. Michael and Sophia's relationship, though tested, ultimately survived, strengthened by Sophia's eventual commitment to stand beside him and his family. Evelyn Carter returned to her home in Virginia, her grace and strength leaving a lasting impression on everyone except perhaps those too blinded by prejudice to see it. William Carter, having defended his mother's honor, returned to his global work, his brief, impactful appearance serving as a potent reminder that true influence stemmed from character, not just capital. The story became a quiet legend in certain circles, a tale of snobbery spectacularly backfiring, a reminder that judging by appearances could lead to profound humiliation, and that dignity, like Evelyn Carter herself, possessed a quiet strength that could silence even the loudest arrogance. The Montgomerys learned, the hard way, that true class had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with character.